Okay, hello everyone. So firstly, thank you all for tuning in to my talk today, which is part of the York Festival of Ideas. And I'll be discussing how sleep affects the way we process and manage our emotions day to day, and also how a lack of sleep makes us more emotionally vulnerable. So to put simply, I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that napping or sleeping in general is actually an effective solution for when the going gets tough. So before we begin, I'm just going to introduce myself. So my name's Emma Sullivan and I'm a first year PhD student in the psychology department at the University of York. So in my PhD, I'm investigating the role of sleep in emotional processing. And I'm hoping to use new techniques such as virtual reality to enhance our current knowledge about this relationship. So I'm a member of the Sleep, Language and Memory Lab and also the Emotional Processing and Offline Consolidation Labs at York. I completed my undergraduate in psychology also at the University of York. And I then went on to do my master's in psychological research at the University of Oxford. And then in the time between my master's and PhD, I've spent some time working at various different UK universities, working on a range of projects in sleep research and also not in sleep research as well. And I've also spent some time working as a therapeutic administrator at Treat My Sleep. So this is one of the leading services in the UK for the treatment and support of individuals, families and organisations experiencing sleep issues. I've also included my Twitter here where you can keep up to date with my research if you're interested. So before we dive into the content of the talk then, I just want to bring your attention to some of the recent media headlines. So we've got not getting enough sleep stifles positive emotions. Sleep deprivation plays with our emotions. Restricting sleep may affect emotional reactions. Just a few nights of bad sleep upsets your brain. When the going gets tough, have a nap. Sleep deprivation causes an emotional brain disconnect. And finally, sleep deprivation stirs up emotions. So from these headlines then, we get this general idea that not getting enough sleep can kind of play havoc with how we process and deal with our emotions. So an overview of what we're going to cover in today's talk then. So the bulk of this talk is going to discuss the role of sleep with regard to three main components of emotion. So we've got how we remember memories that are emotional, we've got how our body reacts to these emotional memories, we've got how we regulate our emotions. So I'm going to discuss each in turn. So I'll talk about what each one is and how it's usually measured in the psychology lab, and also what we currently know about it in its relation to sleep. And then I'll then briefly discuss how sleep can affect our emotional brain. And finally, I'll touch on what we can do to better our sleep to ensure that we're best set up for optimum emotional functioning. Okay, so going onto our roadmap then, I'll be starting with the first component of emotion, so how we remember memories that are emotional. Okay, so emotional memories are memories of an experience that produce an emotional reaction. So I've got some images here as examples of emotional memories that you might have experienced. So firstly, emotional memories can be positive. So for example, a positive emotional memory could be collecting your degree certificate when you graduated. So as long as you didn't fall over on the stage, this is an example of a positive emotional memory. Emotional memories can also be negative. For example, a negative emotional memory could be, for example, a car crash which you were involved in. So, what I showed to you in those images are examples of emotional memories which occur in real life. So, when we investigate emotional memories, we usually have to investigate them in the psychology lab. So, how do we do this? So in the lab then, we tend to use emotional images or film clips. And these images can be positive, negative, or neutral. So here we've got positive images on the left, neutral in the middle, and negative on the right. And these images can also be high or low in emotional arousal. So here we've got high arousing images on the top and more low arousing images on the bottom. So I'm going to come back and discuss arousal in more detail later in the talk. So the main thing here is that in the lab, we can present images to participants that vary in how emotional they are. So whether they're positive, negative, or neutral. And then in order to look at sleep's role in emotional memories, after participants have viewed these kind of images, they're usually given a night of sleep. So this is either done in the sleep lab or participants are sent home to sleep, or they're sleep deprived, which means that they have to stay awake. And to keep them awake, they're usually allowed to engage in quiet, non-stimulating tasks. So I've got an example here, such as watching David Attenborough documentaries. And then after a night of sleep or sleep deprivation, participants are then shown the images that they saw before, and these images are now mixed in with new images that they've not previously seen. So their memory is tested here by asking them whether a presented image is old or new, so whether they've previously seen the image or not. So in this slide, the image on the left is old, as we've previously seen it, and the image on the right is new, because we've not seen it before. So from these types of experiments then, we're able to assess memory for the images and compare this between participants who slept and participants who were sleep deprived since seeing these images. So when we first started doing these kind of experiments then, they showed us that participants had better memory for emotional images compared to neutral images. And importantly, this was only the case in participants who slept between viewing the images. So participants who were given a night of sleep between viewing these images more accurately recognised an old image as old and a new image as new when the image was emotional and not neutral. So from these studies, it was suggested that sleep is important for helping us to remember particularly emotional memories better than neutral ones. So going back to how these findings relate to our emotional memories in real life then, these findings would imply that yesterday's memory of a dog barking at us will be better remembered than yesterday's memory of us brushing our teeth, for example. And this is when we think about these memories the following morning after a night of sleep. However, more recent studies doing these kind of experiments have shown us that sleep helps us to in fact remember all events and not just emotional events. So participants who were given a night of sleep between viewing the images accurately recognise an old image as old and a new image as new, regardless of whether the image was emotional or neutral. So there's no benefit of one over the other. So going back to how these findings relate to our emotional memories in real life then, these would imply that yesterday's memory of a dog barking at us will be actually remembered just as well as yesterday's memory of us brushing our teeth. And this is again when we think about these memories after we've had a night of sleep. So how do we explain these differences in findings then? So one idea which I'm going to briefly touch on is that sleep may help us better remember emotional memories only under certain conditions. For example, emotional memories have been shown to be better remembered than neutral memories after a night of sleep, when participants are asked to freely recall what they remember about an image, as opposed to asking them whether the image is old or new. So going back to how these relate to our memories in real life then, it may be that if someone asks you what you remember about a dog barking at you yesterday, this is what you remember about brushing your teeth yesterday. You'll remember the details of the dog barking at you better than the details of you brushing your teeth. And again, this is the morning after you've had a night of sleep. So to summarise this section then, initial findings from lab experiments showed us that emotional memories are better remembered after a night of sleep. However, more recent studies have shown us that neutral memories are remembered just as well as emotional memories. So to explain these findings then, one idea suggested we may only be able to better remember emotional memories when we're asked to freely recall these memories after a night of sleep. So taken together, these findings show us that sleep is important in helping us to remember emotional memories. So back to our roadmap, we've just covered how sleep helps us to remember memories that are emotional. So now we're going to move on to look at how sleep affects how our body reacts to these emotional memories. So emotional reactivity can be described here as the affective response which we attach to an event. So by the affective response, I mean the self-reported and physiological response we attach to an event. For example, let's go back to this dog barking at us. Our self-reported response here would be how aroused we think we feel, and our physiological response here might be our heart rate in response to the dog barking at us. So to help us understand the difference between emotional memory and emotional reactivity, again, we'll go back to the example of a dog barking at us. So when a dog barks at us, we have a memory of this, but we also have an affective response to this. For example, we would say that we felt very scared, and we may also have an increased heart rate as well. So emotional reactivity relates to this affective response, and is therefore different from the memory content, so our actual memory of the event. In addition, the more emotional an event is, the higher our affective responses to the event tends to be. So again, the dog barking example is a real life experience. So when we investigate affective responses, we usually have to investigate them in the psychology lab. So again, how do we do this? So in the lab, we tend to present participants again with images that differ in how emotional they are, but this time we get participants to self-rate these images on a scale. For example, we tell participants to rate how happy or unhappy a picture made them feel, also how calm or excited a picture made them feel. We also take physiological measurements here, so when participants are viewing these images. So these include things such as skin conductance ratings, heart rate measurements, pupil diameter, and also facial muscle movements. So the idea here is that the more emotional an image is, the more exciting it will be rated and the higher physiological response will be to the image. So then, in order to look at sleep's role in emotional reactivity, as before, after participants have viewed these kind of images, they're usually given a night of sleep, either in the sleep lab or at home, or they're sleep deprived, so they're asked to stay awake. And again, they can engage in these quiet, non-stimulating activities whilst they're awake. And then after a night of sleep or sleep deprivation, participants are then presented with the images they saw before, and then they rate these images again, and their physiological response is also measured again. So what this does is it lets us measure the change in participants' affective response from either before sleep or sleep deprivation to after sleep or sleep deprivation. So from these kind of experiments, we're able to assess the change in affective response for the images. And then we can compare these between participants who had a night of sleep and participants who stayed awake between viewing these images. So these kind of experiments then showed us that participants' affective responses to emotional images in fact decrease over a night of sleep. So participants rated an emotional image as less exciting and had a lower physiological response, for example, a lower heart rate, when they were shown the image a second time. So going back to how sleep affects emotional reactivity in real life then, so when we remember that dog that barked at us yesterday, after a night of sleep, our affective response to the memory is in fact lower than it was yesterday when the dog barked at us. So from these studies then, it's been suggested that sleep is important for helping us to process emotional events by decreasing the effective response that we attach to these emotional events. So to summarise then, lab findings suggest that sleep decreases our effective response to an emotional memory. So taken together, sleep seems to play an important role in how our body reacts to emotional memories. Okay, so back to our roadmap then. We've just covered how sleep affects how our body reacts to emotional memories. So now we're going to move on to look at how sleep affects how we regulate our emotions. So, emotional regulation here is defined as our ability to control our emotional state in response to an emotional event. And this ability to control our emotional state usually involves using certain strategies to help us cope with an event. And these strategies can be either positive or negative. So we're going to use another real world example here. So let's say we fall over walking to the train station on our way to work, and as it's rush hour, there are a lot of people around. So we might decide to use negative strategies to cope with the event. So these will most likely make us feel more embarrassed and upset about falling over. And they include thoughts such as blaming ourselves for falling over, for example, thinking it's our own fault for being on our phone and not looking ahead, or overly focusing on the situation. So, thinking how embarrassed we feel that everybody saw us fall over. In contrast, we might actually decide to use positive strategies, which will help us feel less embarrassed and help us feel better about falling over. These include things such as reframing the situation in a positive light. So, thinking, well, at least in the future, I will no longer try and use my phone when I'm walking. And also refocusing on the next steps. For example, thinking about that 9 a.m. work meeting you might have. So, in response to an emotional event, we can use a range of strategies, and these strategies can help us change how we feel about an event. So, these strategies, instead of being described as in either negative or positive, can be described as maladaptive, which relates to the negative strategies I mentioned, or adaptive, which relates to these positive strategies I mentioned. So, referring back to our falling over example, using these maladaptive strategies can make our response to the event worse, and using these adaptive strategies can make our response to the event better. So, how do we assess emotional regulation in the lab then, in order to see how it's influenced by sleep? Well, emotional regulation can firstly be assessed using standardized questionnaires. So these questionnaires basically ask participants to report how often they use certain strategies, similar to the ones I've just talked about, in response to a real life event. And emotional regulation has also been assessed in the lab, and it's done by showing participants an emotional film, for example, a scary film, and then instructing participants to use certain strategies to respond to this emotional film. So, for example, after viewing a scary film, participants might get told to think about the film in a more positive light, which here is an example of an adaptive strategy. And then, in order to look at how sleep affects emotional regulation, in some studies, then participants complete questionnaires about their sleep. So, this is done to assess their sleep quality. Or in other studies conducted in the lab, after participants have watched a film clip, they're usually given a night of sleep or they're sleep deprived, which we have seen now in other study designs. So in these studies then, both studies where questionnaires are used and also these lab studies where participants watch film clips, we find that participants who have both poor sleep quality or they've been sleep deprived tend to use these adaptive strategies less frequently. So these positive strategies that make our response to the event better. And they also tend to use these maladaptive strategies more frequently. So there's negative strategies that make our response to the event worse. So going back to our real life example of falling over, if your sleep quality is poor, or if you've been sleep deprived the night before, you're more likely to use these maladaptive negative strategies such as blaming yourself or overly focusing on the situation, making you feel worse about the situation rather than these adaptive positive strategies that will make you feel better about the situation. So therefore, sleep seems to be important in deciding what strategies we use to cope with an emotional event. So to summarize this section, Emotional regulation involves using strategies to cope with an emotional event. So these strategies can be adaptive, making us feel better about a situation. They can also be maladaptive, making us feel worse about a situation. So when our sleep is disturbed, so when we have poor quality sleep or we're sleep deprived, we're more likely to use these maladaptive strategies, making us feel worse about the situation, rather than these adaptive strategies that will make us feel better about a situation. So therefore, sleep is important in determining how we respond to an emotional event. Back to the roadmap, we've just covered how sleep affects our ability to regulate our emotions. So now we're going to move on to look at how sleep affects the emotional brain. So as we can't see someone's brain just by looking at them, and we can't ask them to tell us how active certain areas of their brain are, how do we measure emotional brain activity in the lab then? So in lab studies that have looked at this, participants are given a full night of sleep, or they're asked to stay awake, because you're all now quite familiar with this design. And then after a night of sleep or sleep deprivation, participants then go inside an MRI scanner. So an MRI scanner is a machine that measures your brain activity. And when they're in the MRI scanner, they view images presented through visual goggles. And again, these images vary in how emotional they are. So whilst participants are viewing these images in the scanner, we can look at how their emotional brain is reacting to these images. So studies have focused on one brain structure in particular, and this is called the amygdala. So the amygdala is the centerpiece region for the generation of strong emotional reactions. So when looking at those people who had a full night of sleep, what we see is a nice, appropriate, moderate degree of activity coming from the amygdala when participants view these emotional images. However, in those participants who are sleep deprived, this deep emotional center is in fact hyperactive. So indeed, the amygdala is almost 60% more reactive under conditions of a lack of sleep when viewing these emotional images. So when thinking about why this is the case then, it's also discovered that there is this other brain region that's involved. So this brain region is called the prefrontal cortex, and it sits directly above your eyes. So you can think of the prefrontal cortex almost like the kind of CEO of your brain. So it's really good at making these high-level executive top-down decisions and reactions. And it's one of the most evolved regions of our brain. And one part of the brain it controls is this deep emotion center, the amygdala. So in those participants who have a full night of sleep, what you see is this nice, strong communication and connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. However, in those participants who are sleep deprived, that communication and that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is essentially severed. So as a consequence, the amygdala is responding far more reactively due to this lack of sleep. So this combination of heightened activity in the amygdala and this reduced regulatory connection with the prefrontal cortex seems to be the reason why we become so unbuckled in terms of our emotional integrity without sleep. So let's go back to the example of the dog barking at us. So after a lack of sleep, when we think about the dog barking at us, our amygdala is going to be responding far more reactively compared to if we'd had a night of sleep. So therefore, sleep seems to be important in ensuring that we respond to emotional events in the appropriate manner. Okay, so to summarize this section then, brain regions including the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex have been found to be important in emotional responding. So a lack of sleep can result in increased activity in the amygdala and a reduced connection and connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So this can result in inappropriate brain responses to emotional events. Therefore, sleep is important for ensuring we respond appropriately to emotional events. So going back to our roadmap, I've now highlighted the importance of sleep in how we remember memories that are emotional, how our body reacts to these emotional memories, and how we regulate our emotions. And I've also just briefly outlined how a lack of sleep can disrupt our brain responses to emotional events. So hopefully by now I've convinced you that sleep is important in how we process and deal with our emotions. And also that a lack of sleep can disrupt the brain processes that are fundamental to emotional functioning. So finally, before the talk ends, I want to touch upon what we can do to better our sleep to ensure that we are functioning optimally, particularly in the emotional domain. So no doubt, anything you've kind of read about improving your sleep has mentioned sleep hygiene practices, and you may have even tried some of these yourself. But today we're going to go beyond this and we're going to highlight 5 principles of sleep health. So these were created by Professor Colin Espy, who is a professor of sleep medicine at the University of Oxford. And I think that these are really important to discuss with regards to how we can get our sleep as healthy as it can be to ensure that we're functioning at our best. I'm going to outline these principles now. So the first principle is valuing your sleep. So this involves recognizing that your sleep plays an essential role, not only in emotional processing, as I've hopefully convinced you in this talk, but also in other things like the renewal and repair of body tissue, your metabolism, your infection control, and your learning and memory capabilities. In addition, the quality of your daytime alertness, your energy, your productivity levels, and your mood is greatly dependent on your sleep. So it's therefore important that we recognize sleep to be just as vital as things like drinking water and eating sufficient food. So we need to take sleep seriously, we need to value it, and we even need to prize it. The second principle then involves us prioritizing our sleep. So this means putting sleep first more often and putting it higher up on the list when it comes to making choices of what you want to do. So social pressure might come into play here, but it's important to recognize it's actually okay to say you need to get your sleep. So we need to be making commitments and setting goals to create the necessary allocated time for sleep in our daily lives. The third principle then involves personalizing your sleep. So this relates to understanding that your personal sleep requirement may be different to other people's. It encourages us to experiment to find the best fit in terms of how much sleep we need and when we actually sleep best. So it's important here that we accept who we are and we personalize our sleep by getting the sleep we require and when we require it. The fourth principle relates to us trusting our sleep. So once we've personalized our sleep, we must trust our sleep to get itself into a good pattern. And therefore, sleep should drive us rather than us driving it. So a couple of useful suggestions here are if you can't sleep, just get up and go back to bed when you feel sleepy again. So try to go to bed for shorter periods of time so that you're properly sleepy when you settle down. And also to try and get up at the same time every morning. So all of these can help establish sleep patterns which you can then trust. Then our final sleep principle we'll discuss is protecting our sleep. So this is avoiding and preventing things that can cause upset to our sleep. So this involves things like sticking to a pattern, putting the day to rest before we go to sleep, not forcing ourselves to sleep, avoiding stimulants such as caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine before bedtime, and also avoiding tablets and smartphones that might keep us awake. Importantly, the idea here is to protect your bedroom and bedtime hours as the time and the place for sleep. So to summarize these principles then, it's important that we take sleep seriously, we value it and we prize it. We must also make commitments and set goals to prioritize the necessary space for sleep. We must personalize our sleep, getting the sleep we require and when we require it. We must trust our sleep to get itself into a good pattern. And finally, we must protect our sleep from the things that cause upset to it. However, it's important to note here that these may not be enough if you actually have a long-standing sleep problem. So in this case, please don't hesitate to contact your GP to discuss these problems. So to conclude, I hope that I've convinced you in this talk that sleep is important in how we process our emotions. I also hope I've offered you with some initial insight into how we can better our sleep to ensure optimum emotional functioning. So I'll end this talk with the final reminder that when the going gets tough, you should take a nap because you will feel better for it. Thank you all so much for listening. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have.